Behind the gilded gates of Buckingham Palace, a monarch wrestles with the weight of centuries-old tradition while watching the world change in ways his predecessors could never have imagined. King Charles III, a man who spent 7 decades preparing for the throne, now faces his greatest challenge yet: maintaining the delicate balance of constitutional monarchy while dealing with one of history's most unpredictable world leaders. This is not just another political story. This is the intimate account of how personal convictions clash with royal duty, how private conversations shape public policy, and how even a king must sometimes bite his tongue when the stakes are nothing less than the future of the special relationship between two nations. What happens when diplomatic protocol meets personal principles? When a lifetime of environmental advocacy collides with climate change denial? When measured royal restraint encounters unprecedented political chaos? The answer lies in the untold story of King Charles III's complex relationship with Donald Trump, a relationship that would test every fiber of his being, challenge the very foundation of modern monarchy, and ultimately reveal the true cost of keeping the crown above politics while the world burns around it. This is that story. The morning mist hung low over Windsor Castle as King Charles III stood at the window of his private study, watching the groundskeepers tend to the ancient gardens below. His hands, weathered by age but steady with purpose, clasped behind his back as he contemplated the day ahead. It was June 29th, and in just a few hours he would host one of the most controversial figures in modern politics, Donald Trump, the 45th President of the United States. Charles had spent decades preparing for moments like this. As Prince of Wales, he had mastered the art of diplomatic conversation, learned to smile politely at heads of state whose policies made his stomach turn, and perfected the royal ability to remain neutral in public while harboring strong private opinions. But Trump was different. Everything about the American president challenged the very foundations of what Charles believed in: environmental protection, diplomatic decorum, and the careful preservation of international alliances. The King's private secretary, Sir Clive Alderton, entered the study carrying a thick briefing folder. His expression was carefully neutral, but Charles could read the concern in his aide's eyes. They had been preparing for this state visit for months, and every detail had to be perfect. The relationship between Britain and America was too important to allow personal feelings to interfere. "Your Majesty," Alderton began, setting the folder on the mahogany desk, "the final briefings from the Foreign Office." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "They've emphasized the importance of maintaining positive relations, particularly given the ongoing Brexit negotiations." Charles nodded, though his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He understood the politics. Britain needed America's support as it navigated its departure from the European Union. Trade deals, security partnerships, and economic stability all hung in the balance. But understanding the necessity didn't make it any easier to stomach. The King picked up the briefing folder, its weight seeming heavier than it should. Inside were detailed notes about Trump's policies, his temperament, his preferred conversation topics, and most importantly, the subjects to avoid. Climate change topped that list, followed by international environmental agreements and renewable energy initiatives, precisely the areas where Charles had spent most of his adult life advocating for change. As he flipped through the pages, Charles couldn't help but think about his decades of environmental work. Long before it was fashionable, he had been warning about the dangers of climate change, promoting organic farming, and championing sustainable development. He had given speeches to empty rooms, endured mockery from the press, and faced criticism for being ahead of his time. Now, as king, those same causes felt more urgent than ever, and yet he was expected to smile and make pleasant conversation with a man who had withdrawn America from the Paris Climate Agreement. The irony wasn't lost on him. His mother, Queen Elizabeth II, had navigated similar challenges throughout her reign, posting dictators and controversial leaders with the same grace she showed to beloved allies. She had understood that the crown existed above politics, that personal feelings had no place in state business. Charles had watched her do it countless times, marveling at her ability to compartmentalize her emotions. Now it was his turn. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. His equerry announced that the American delegation had arrived at Heathrow Airport. Within the hour, Trump would be at Buckingham Palace, and the careful choreography of diplomacy would begin. Charles closed the briefing folder and straightened his tie. Whatever his personal feelings, he was the King of England, and his duty was clear. The drive to Buckingham Palace gave Charles time to steel himself for what lay ahead. As the royal car wound through London streets, he observed the protesters gathering along the route. Thousands of people held signs denouncing Trump's policies, particularly his stance on climate change and immigration. Their anger was palpable, their frustration evident in every chanted slogan. Charles felt a strange kinship with them. They were expressing the outrage he couldn't.
At the palace, the staff bustled with final preparations.
The staterooms had been prepared with meticulous attention to detail, each piece of china and crystal positioned perfectly. The menu for the state banquet had been reviewed and approved, taking into account Trump's well-documented preferences for simple, familiar foods. Even the guest list had been carefully curated to avoid potential diplomatic landmines. Charles made his way to the Grand Hall, where he would formally greet the American president. The room, with its soaring ceilings and historic portraits, had witnessed centuries of diplomatic encounters. Kings and queens had stood in this very spot to welcome allies and adversaries alike, always maintaining the dignity of the crown, regardless of their personal feelings about their guests. As he waited, Charles reflected on the broader implications of this visit. The special relationship between Britain and America had weathered many storms over the decades. Churchill and Roosevelt, Thatcher and Reagan, Blair and Bush, each pairing had its own dynamic, its own challenges and triumphs. But this felt different. Trump's unpredictability, his tendency to say whatever came to mind, and his disregard for traditional diplomatic norms made him unlike any American president in recent memory. The king's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of the American motorcade approaching. Through the palace windows, he could see the line of black vehicles snaking through the courtyard, preceded by British police escorts and followed by Secret Service agents. The machinery of state was in motion, and Charles took a deep breath, preparing to play his part in this carefully orchestrated display of international friendship. Sir Clive appeared at his side, offering a final word of encouragement. "Remember, Your Majesty, this is about more than just one meeting. This is about preserving relationships that have endured for generations." Charles nodded, understanding the weight of those words. His personal feelings about Trump were irrelevant in the face of his constitutional duty. The great doors of the palace opened, and Trump appeared, flanked by his wife Melania and a entourage of advisors. Charles straightened his shoulders and prepared to greet the man who represented everything he privately opposed. As he stepped forward with a carefully practiced smile, he reminded himself that he was not just King Charles III in this moment. He was the embodiment of the British crown, guardian of traditions that stretched back centuries, and custodian of relationships that would outlast any single presidency. The handshake was firm, the smiles bright for the cameras, and the pleasantries flowed with practiced ease. To the watching world, it appeared to be just another diplomatic encounter between allied leaders. But for Charles, it was the beginning of one of the most challenging tests of his reign, maintaining royal composure while everything he believed in was being challenged by the man standing beside him. As they walked together toward the staterooms, Charles wondered if his mother had ever felt this internal conflict so acutely. Elizabeth II had met her share of controversial leaders, but had she ever felt quite this level of personal opposition to everything a visiting head of state represented? He suspected she had, and that thought gave him strength. If she could do it, so could he. The cameras flashed, the crowds cheered, and the pageantry of a British state visit unfolded with its usual splendor. But beneath the surface, King Charles III was learning one of the hardest lessons of kingship, that sometimes duty requires you to smile when every instinct tells you to speak your mind, to be gracious when you want to be honest, and to preserve relationships that matter more than your own comfort or convictions. The day was just beginning, and already Charles could feel the weight of the crown more heavily than ever before. The private lunch at Clarence House was meant to be intimate, away from the formal protocol of Buckingham Palace. Charles had specifically requested this setting, hoping that a more relaxed atmosphere might allow for genuine conversation. As he watched Trump settle into the silk-upholstered chair across from him, the king couldn't help but notice how the American president seemed to fill whatever room he entered, his presence both commanding and somehow unsettling. Camilla, the queen consort, had been instrumental in planning this gathering. Her natural warmth and conversational skills had smoothed many diplomatic encounters over the years, and Charles hoped her presence would help bridge the cultural and philosophical gulf between himself and his guest. She chatted easily with Melania Trump about the palace gardens, discussing the heritage roses that Charles had so carefully cultivated over the decades. The conversation during the first course remained safely neutral. Discussion of the beautiful June weather, the historical significance of Clarence House, and mutual admiration for the pageantry of British royal ceremonies. Trump seemed genuinely fascinated by the traditions surrounding the monarchy, asking detailed questions about the coronation process and the symbolic meaning of various regalia. For a moment, Charles allowed himself to hope that this might be easier than he had anticipated. But as the lunch progressed, the conversation inevitably turned to more substantive matters. Trump, never one to avoid controversial topics, began expressing his views on international trade deals with characteristic bluntness. Charles listened politely as the president criticized various multinational agreements, his tone growing more animated as he outlined his America First philosophy. The king found himself gripping his napkin beneath the table, forcing his expression to remain pleasantly neutral. The real test came when Trump casually mentioned his skepticism about climate change research. "You know, Charles," he said, using the king's first name with a familiarity that felt both presumptuous and somehow authentic, "a lot of these climate scientists, they're just trying to get funding for their research. The whole thing might be overblown." Charles felt his pulse quicken. This was precisely the territory his advisors had warned him to avoid. Yet here was Trump diving headfirst into the very issue that had defined much of the king's life work. For a moment the room seemed to hang in suspended silence. Camilla's eyes flickered toward her husband, knowing how deeply these words would affect him. The king took a careful sip of water, buying himself time to formulate a response that would be both honest and diplomatically appropriate. "Well, Mr. President," he began, his voice measured and calm, "I've had the privilege of working with many scientists over the years. The evidence they've shared has been quite compelling." He paused, choosing his next words carefully. "Of course, these are complex issues, and reasonable people can examine the same evidence and reach different conclusions." It was a masterclass in diplomatic non-confrontation, acknowledging Trump's position without endorsing it, while gently indicating his own different perspective. But Charles could feel the strain of holding back his true thoughts, the weight of decades of passionate advocacy being compressed into polite understatement. Trump, seemingly oblivious to the king's internal struggle, continued his critique of environmental regulations, describing them as job killers and economic burdens. With each word, Charles felt his diplomatic reserve being tested. This was a man who had withdrawn the United States from the Paris Climate Agreement, who had rolled back environmental protections, who seemed to view the planet's crisis as nothing more than a political talking point. The king found himself remembering a conversation he'd had with his mother years earlier. Elizabeth II had advised him that the crown's greatest power often lay in what it chose not to say, in the grace it showed under pressure, and in its ability to maintain relationships that transcended individual personalities or political moments. "We are the constant in an ever-changing world," she had told him. "People need to know that some things remain steady, even when everything else seems to be shifting." As lunch continued, Charles demonstrated the wisdom of that advice. When Trump criticized the European Union's environmental standards, the king smoothly redirected the conversation to discuss British innovation in green technology, a topic that allowed him to express his genuine enthusiasm without directly challenging his guest. When the president questioned the effectiveness of international cooperation on climate issues, Charles shared stories about successful conservation projects he had personally supported, framing them as inspiring examples of human ingenuity rather than implicit criticisms of Trump's policies. The conversation took an unexpected turn when Trump began asking about Charles's personal interests. The president seemed genuinely curious about the king's passion for organic farming, his architectural preservation work, and his long-standing commitment to traditional crafts and skills. For the first time during the meal, Charles felt himself relaxing slightly. These were subjects he could discuss with authentic enthusiasm, and Trump's questions seemed driven by genuine interest rather than political posturing. "You really believe in this stuff, don't you?" Trump asked, leaning forward as Charles described his efforts to promote sustainable agriculture. There was something almost childlike in the president's curiosity, and for a moment Charles glimpsed the person beneath the political persona.
"I do,"
Charles replied simply.
"I believe we have a responsibility to leave the world better than we found it."
He met Trump's gaze directly, allowing a hint of his true passion to show through his diplomatic reserve. "It's not about politics for me. It's about the future we're creating for our children and grandchildren." Trump nodded slowly, though whether an agreement or simple acknowledgement was impossible to tell. The moment passed quickly as the conversation moved to other topics. But Charles felt that he had managed to communicate something genuine without overstepping his constitutional bounds. As the lunch drew to a close, both men seemed to recognize that they had successfully navigated a potentially treacherous diplomatic encounter. They had found common ground in their shared interest in preserving traditions and supporting craftsmanship, even as their fundamental worldviews remained miles apart. Charles had managed to express his values without directly confronting Trump's opposing positions, while Trump had shown enough curiosity and respect to keep the conversation productive. But as the American delegation prepared to leave Clarence House, Charles couldn't shake the feeling that he had somehow failed a crucial test. Not a diplomatic test, he had performed his constitutional role flawlessly, Rather, he felt he had failed some deeper moral obligation to speak truth to power, to use his platform to advocate for the causes he held most dear. Walking Trump to his waiting car, Charles maintained his gracious demeanor, shaking hands warmly and expressing hopes for continued cooperation between their two nations. The cameras captured the moment, showing two leaders parting on friendly terms. The diplomatic machinery had functioned exactly as designed, but as the motorcade disappeared through the gates of Clarence House, Charles stood for a moment in his doorway, feeling the weight of unspoken words. He had preserved the special relationship, maintained royal neutrality, and avoided any diplomatic incidents. He had done his duty as king. The question that would haunt him in the days to come was whether doing his duty as king had required him to fail in his duty as a human being who understood the urgent reality of the climate crisis. It was a question that would define much of his early reign, the constant tension between constitutional responsibility and personal conviction, between the crown's traditional neutrality and the modern world's urgent need for moral leadership. As he returned to his study, Charles picked up a letter from a young environmental activist who had written to thank him for his decades of climate advocacy. The words on the page seemed to mock him now, praising him for his courage in speaking truth about environmental issues when others remained silent. How could he explain that kingship had robbed him of the very voice these young people were counting on? The afternoon stretched ahead with more meetings, more careful conversations, and more diplomatic dancing around the issues that mattered most to him. Charles settled behind his desk and began preparing for the next encounter, wondering how many more times he would have to smile and nod while everything he believed in was dismissed or ignored. The crown was heavy indeed. The ballroom at Buckingham Palace gleamed under the light of crystal chandeliers as staff members made final adjustments to the horseshoe-shaped table that would seat 170 distinguished guests. Each place setting represented hours of meticulous planning. The George IV State Service gleamed against pristine white tablecloths, while elaborate floral arrangements featuring British roses and American hydrangeas provided elegant centerpieces. For King Charles III, surveying the scene from the gallery above, it was both magnificent and ominous. This state banquet represented the pinnacle of British diplomatic hospitality, a tradition refined over centuries to project soft power through spectacular pageantry. Every detail had been calculated to impress and honor the visiting head of state, from the selection of wines to the precise choreography of the evening's events. But Charles found himself dreading the hours ahead, knowing that he would be expected to deliver a speech that somehow balanced honesty with diplomacy while sitting mere feet from a man whose policies he found fundamentally objectionable. The guest list had been a particular source of tension during the planning process. The Foreign Office had insisted on including business leaders who might facilitate post-Brexit trade deals, while Charles had quietly pushed for the inclusion of prominent scientists and environmental advocates. The final compromise satisfied neither completely, resulting in a gathering that mixed titans of industry, with climate researchers, conservative politicians, with renewable energy entrepreneurs, creating an undercurrent of potential conflict beneath the evening's polished veneer. As Charles retreated to his private apartments to prepare for the evening, he found himself thinking about the speech he would deliver in just a few hours. The draft had gone through multiple revisions, with each version softening his language about international cooperation and environmental responsibility. The Foreign Office had been particularly concerned about any references that might be interpreted as criticism of Trump's withdrawal from the Paris Climate Agreement or his administration's environmental policies. The King's dresser helped him into his evening wear, white tie and tails with the blue sash of the Order of the Garter, the same formal attire worn by British monarchs at state banquets for generations. As he studied his reflection in the mirror, Charles wondered if his predecessors had felt this same sense of internal conflict when hosting controversial world leaders. Had his mother wrestled with similar doubts when entertaining dictators and strongmen? Had she ever felt that the demands of diplomacy required her to betray her own moral convictions? The arrival ceremony in the palace courtyard had passed without incident earlier in the day, but Charles knew that the real test would come during the intimate setting of the banquet. With cameras capturing every gesture and microphones recording every word, there would be no room for the kind of careful diplomatic language that had served him during their private lunch. The speech would be broadcast around the world, analyzed by commentators, and scrutinized for any hint of the king's true feelings about his controversial guest. As the appointed hour approached, Charles made his way to the green drawing room, where he would meet Trump before processing into the ballroom. The president was already waiting, resplendent in white tie and clearly enjoying the grandeur of the occasion. Melania Trump wore an elegant evening gown that complemented the formal splendor of the setting, And for a moment, Charles allowed himself to appreciate the visual spectacle they would create processing into dinner together. The conversation while they waited was mercifully brief and safely neutral, focusing on the impressive nature of the palace and the honor of the occasion. But Charles could see something calculating in Trump's eyes, awareness that this evening represented a significant diplomatic victory for his administration. Being hosted by the British monarch with full state honors would provide powerful imagery for domestic political consumption, particularly as Trump faced criticism at home for his handling of various international crises. The procession into the ballroom was a masterpiece of royal theatre. Led by the household cavalry's silver trumpeters, the two couples walked slowly through crowds of applauding guests toward the top table. Charles had participated in dozens of such ceremonies, but tonight he felt acutely aware of every step, every smile, every gesture that would be captured and broadcast around the world. The weight of the crown seemed particularly heavy as he acknowledged the assembled dignitaries with careful nods and practiced smiles. As they took their places at the high table, Charles noticed several familiar faces in the crowd that gave him pause. Dr. Jane Goodall sat near the middle of the horseshoe, her presence a reminder of the environmental battles being fought while he engaged in diplomatic pleasantries. Several prominent climate scientists were scattered throughout the room, their research directly contradicting many of Trump's public statements about global warming. The king wondered what they must think as they watched him play the gracious host to a man who had actively undermined their work. The dinner conversation flowed along predictable lines, with Trump holding court about his business experiences and his impressions of Britain. Charles found himself genuinely impressed by the president's knowledge of British history, particularly his familiarity with various royal residences and their architectural significance. For brief moments, he could almost forget the political chasm between them as they discussed the restoration challenges at Windsor Castle and the historical importance of maintaining traditional craftsmanship. But the underlying tension never fully disappeared. When conversation turned to international trade, Charles watched Trump's demeanor shift into his more familiar combative mode. The president spoke dismissively of multilateral agreements and expressed frustration with allies who failed to appreciate American generosity. Each comment felt like a subtle criticism of the international cooperation that Charles believed was essential for addressing global challenges like climate change. The real test came when it was time for the speeches. Charles rose first, the traditional protocol requiring the host to speak before the honored guest. As he looked out over the assembled crowd, he could see faces reflecting the full spectrum of British society, from ardent Trump supporters to vocal critics, from business leaders eager for American investment to activists who had protested outside the palace earlier that day. The King's speech was a masterclass in diplomatic language, praising the enduring friendship between Britain and America while carefully avoiding any specific endorsement of current American policies. He spoke eloquently about shared values and common heritage, about the importance of allies standing together in challenging times, and about the responsibility of great nations to lead by example. Every word had been carefully chosen to sound supportive without being specific, to honor the relationship while avoiding any statement that might be seen as political endorsement. But even as he delivered these carefully crafted phrases, Charles felt the weight of what he wasn't saying. He spoke about leadership and responsibility without mentioning climate change. He praised American innovation without acknowledging the country's withdrawal from environmental agreements. He celebrated shared values while remaining silent about the specific policies that contradicted those values. It was perhaps the most diplomatic speech of his life, and also the most personally frustrating. Trump's responding speech was vintage Trump rambling, personal, and filled with superlatives about the evening's magnificence. He praised the Queen's legacy, complimented the palace's grandeur, and expressed gratitude for British hospitality in terms that were both genuinely appreciative and characteristically self-aggrandizing. The president seemed genuinely moved by the pageantry of the occasion, and Charles found himself almost warming to this more vulnerable side of his guest. As the evening progressed through multiple courses and flowing wine, the atmosphere grew more relaxed. Charles observed Trump working the room with natural political instincts, charming dinner partners with stories and jokes, while carefully avoiding any controversial topics that might create diplomatic incidents. It was a reminder that beneath the controversial public persona was a skilled politician who understood the importance of personal relationships in international affairs. The musical entertainment that concluded the evening featured selections that had been chosen to reflect both British and American cultural traditions. As the guests enjoyed performances by the Royal Marines Band, Charles noticed Trump tapping his foot to the familiar melodies, his earlier bombastic energy replaced by something approaching genuine appreciation for the artistry on display. But even as the evening concluded successfully, Without diplomatic incident, Charles couldn't shake the feeling that something important had been lost in translation.
The pageantry had been flawless, the hospitality generous, and the political objectives achieved.
Yet he felt that the very success of the evening represented a kind of moral failure. That by hosting Trump with such honor and avoiding any mention of their fundamental disagreements, he had somehow legitimized policies he found abhorrent. As the last guests departed and the palace staff began the massive cleanup operation, Charles retreated to his private study with a mixture of relief and regret.
The diplomatic mission had been accomplished, the special relationship preserved, and the constitutional monarchy's tradition of political neutrality maintained. But at what cost? And how many more such evenings would his reign require, each one asking him to choose between his duties as king and his convictions as a human being? The questions would follow him long into the night, as he grappled with the realization that wearing the crown sometimes meant setting aside the very principles that had shaped his life before he inherited the throne. The private telephone call came 3 months after the state visit, catching King Charles in his study at Highgrove House as autumn painted the Gloucestershire countryside in brilliant golds and reds. His private secretary's voice carried an unusual note of concern as he announced that President Trump was requesting a personal conversation with His Majesty. No agenda had been provided, no diplomatic preview offered through the usual channels. Just a direct request from one head of state to another, which protocol demanded could not be refused. Charles accepted the call with the same sense of apprehension he might feel before a difficult medical procedure. The intervening months since Trump's state visit had brought a steady stream of policy decisions that ran counter to everything the king believed in. America's formal withdrawal from the Paris Climate Agreement had been completed, environmental regulations continued to be rolled back, and Trump's rhetoric about climate change had grown increasingly dismissive. Each news cycle brought fresh reminders of the gulf between Charles's environmental convictions and his constitutional obligation to maintain friendly relations with the American president. The conversation began with Trump's characteristic blend of flattery and bombast. He effusively praised the state visit, describing it as one of the most magnificent events he had ever attended. The pageantry, the hospitality, the historical significance of dining in Buckingham Palace, all of it had clearly made a deep impression on the American president. Charles found himself genuinely warmed by Trump's enthusiasm, even as he remained wary of where the conversation might lead.
"Charles, I have to tell you," Trump continued, his voice carrying across the Atlantic with surprising clarity, "that visit really meant something to me. The way you and Camilla treated Melania and me, the respect you showed, it was incredible. Really incredible." The king murmured appropriate responses, acknowledging the pleasure the visit had brought to him as well, while privately wondering what had prompted this unexpected outreach. Trump rarely made calls without a specific agenda, and Charles's experience had taught him to be particularly cautious when politicians began conversations with excessive praise. The real purpose became clear when Trump shifted to discussing his upcoming re-election campaign and the challenges he was facing from political opponents. "They're attacking me on everything, Charles," Trump complained, his tone growing more animated. "Even my environmental policies, which have been tremendous for American business, they don't understand that we can't let climate regulations destroy our economy." Charles felt his stomach tighten as the conversation veered into precisely the territory he most wanted to avoid. Here was Trump apparently seeking some form of validation or support from the British monarch for policies that Charles found deeply troubling. The president seemed to be treating their personal relationship as a kind of endorsement, suggesting that the warm reception he had received in Britain somehow validated his approach to governance. The king chose his words with extreme care, acknowledging Trump's concerns about balancing economic and environmental considerations, while avoiding any statement that might be interpreted as agreement with specific policies. "These are indeed complex challenges," Charles responded diplomatically. "Every leader must weigh multiple considerations when making such important decisions." But Trump seemed determined to push the conversation into more specific territory. He began outlining his administration's achievements in energy production, his success in reducing regulations that he claimed were hindering American competitiveness, and his skepticism about the scientific consensus on climate change. With each statement, Charles felt the weight of his constitutional constraints more acutely. Here was arguably the most powerful man in the world, actively undermining efforts to address what Charles believed was humanity's greatest challenge, and protocol prevented him from responding with anything approaching honest disagreement. The conversation took an even more troubling turn when Trump began discussing his relationships with other world leaders, offering candid assessments of various European politicians and their environmental policies.
His dismissive comments about leaders Charles respected, coupled with his apparent assumption that the king shared his skeptical views about climate action, created a deeply uncomfortable dynamic. Charles found himself in the bizarre position of listening to criticisms of policies he strongly supported, while being unable to express any disagreement. Perhaps most disturbingly, Trump seemed to interpret Charles's diplomatic silence as tacit agreement. "You understand these things, Charles," the president said with apparent satisfaction. "You're a practical man. You know that we can't let environmental extremists destroy our economies in pursuit of some theoretical future problem." The king felt a flash of anger so intense that he had to pause before responding, using the brief silence to regain his composure. Every instinct told him to correct Trump's mischaracterization, to explain that climate change was not theoretical but immediate and urgent, to defend the scientists and activists Trump was dismissing as extremists. Instead, he found himself offering another diplomatically neutral response about the complexity of balancing various national interests. As the call continued, Charles became increasingly aware of how Trump was likely to interpret and potentially use this conversation. The president had a well-documented tendency to claim support from world leaders, often exaggerating the substance of private conversations for political benefit. The thought that his forced diplomatic politeness might be twisted into an endorsement of policies he opposed filled Charles with a deep sense of unease. The king attempted to steer the conversation towards safer ground, inquiring about Trump's family and expressing hopes for continued cooperation between their two countries on areas of mutual interest. But Trump kept returning to his policy agenda, seemingly eager to have Charles acknowledge the wisdom of his approach to environmental issues. It was as if the president genuinely believed that the warm reception he had received during his state visit constituted some form of royal approval for his entire governing philosophy. When Trump mentioned his plans to visit Britain again, possibly during the following year, Charles felt a familiar knot form in his stomach. The thought of hosting another elaborate diplomatic celebration for a leader whose policies he found increasingly objectionable was almost unbearable. Yet he knew that such visits were not matters of personal preference, but constitutional obligations, diplomatic necessities that transcended individual feelings or political disagreements. The conversation finally began winding down after nearly 30 minutes, with Trump expressing his appreciation for Charles's friendship and his hope that they would continue to work together on matters of mutual interest. As they exchanged formal farewells, Charles felt exhausted by the effort required to maintain diplomatic courtesy, while every word seemed to conflict with his deepest convictions. After ending the call, Charles sat in silence for several minutes, staring out at the gardens he had spent decades cultivating according to organic principles. The irony wasn't lost on him. Here he was, surrounded by living proof of his environmental commitment, having just spent half an hour listening politely as those very principles were dismissed and derided by one of the world's most influential leaders. The king's private secretary knocked and entered, clearly eager to debrief about the unexpected call. But Charles found himself reluctant to discuss the details, partly out of respect for diplomatic confidentiality, but mostly because he wasn't sure how to articulate his growing frustration with the constraints of his constitutional role. How could he explain that his duty to remain above politics was forcing him to remain silent about the most important issue of his lifetime? In the days following the call, Charles found himself obsessing over Trump's comments and his own responses. He replayed conversations in his mind, wondering if he could have found ways to express his views more clearly without overstepping constitutional boundaries. He consulted constitutional experts about the limits of royal expression on political matters, seeking some framework that might allow him to speak more honestly about issues he cared deeply about. But the experts' advice only reinforced what he already knew, that constitutional monarchy required him to remain scrupulously neutral on political matters, even when those matters involved what he believed were existential threats to the planet's future. The crown's legitimacy depended on its ability to stand above partisan politics, to serve as a unifying symbol for the nation regardless of which party held power or which policies were being pursued. As autumn deepened into winter, Charles found himself increasingly isolated by his royal role. The environmental activism that had defined much of his life as Prince of Wales was now effectively silenced by the constitutional requirements of kingship. The very platform that gave him global influence also robbed him of the ability to use that influence on the issues that mattered most to him. The king began to understand why his mother had so rarely expressed strong personal opinions during her long reign. Not because she lacked convictions, but because expressing them would have undermined the carefully constructed neutrality that allowed the monarchy to survive in a democratic age. It was a sacrifice that came with the crown, a price paid for the privilege of serving as head of state in a constitutional democracy. Yet knowing the necessity of his silence didn't make it any easier to bear. especially as each news cycle brought fresh evidence of the urgent need for climate action. Charles found himself trapped between his duty as king and his conscience as a human being, wondering how many more conversations with leaders like Trump he could endure without compromising either his constitutional role or his fundamental principles. The secure briefing room beneath Buckingham Palace felt colder than usual as King Charles III reviewed the intelligence reports that had prompted this emergency meeting. It was January 2024, and the documents spread across the mahogany table painted a troubling picture of increasing global instability, much of it linked to climate-related disasters and resource conflicts that his environmental work had long predicted. Yet here he sat, constitutionally bound to silence, while the very crises he had spent decades warning about unfolded with devastating consequences. Sir Clive Alderton, his private secretary, sat across from him with representatives from the Foreign Office and the Cabinet Office. The meeting had been called to discuss the delicate diplomatic situation created by Trump's recent statements about NATO commitments and his renewed criticism of European environmental policies. The former president, now running again for office, had specifically mentioned his great relationship with King Charles during several campaign rallies, suggesting a level of personal support that made the palace deeply uncomfortable. "The concern, Your Majesty," explained the Foreign Office representative, "is that these statements could be interpreted as the Crown endorsing particular American political positions. We're receiving inquiries from allied nations about the extent of your relationship with President Trump and whether these comments reflect official British policy." Charles studied the transcripts of Trump's recent speeches, each reference to their friendship and mutual understanding, feeling like another chain binding him to a relationship he had never sought and increasingly struggled to maintain. The man who had once been merely a diplomatic obligation had become a persistent shadow over his reign, a constant reminder of the impossible position in which the modern monarchy often found itself. The king's mind wandered to a conversation he'd had the previous week with his son William, who had expressed growing frustration with the constitutional constraints that prevented the royal family from speaking out on climate change. "How can we claim to serve the people while remaining silent about the greatest threat they face?" William had asked, his voice carrying the same passionate conviction that Charles remembered from his own younger years. It was a question that haunted Charles daily. The scientific evidence had become overwhelming, the consequences increasingly visible. Yet his role required him to smile politely at leaders who dismissed or actively undermined efforts to address the crisis. Each diplomatic encounter felt like a betrayal of everything he had worked for before becoming king. Every gracious reception a tacit endorsement of policies he knew to be dangerous. The briefing continued with updates on various international environmental initiatives where British leadership was being sought. Renewable energy partnerships, climate adaptation funding, carbon capture research. All areas where Charles's expertise and passion could have made a real difference. Yet his constitutional role relegated him to ceremonial ribbon cuttings and carefully scripted speeches that said nothing meaningful about the urgency of the moment. "There's also the matter of the upcoming Commonwealth Summit," Alderton mentioned, consulting his notes. "Several member nations have specifically requested your involvement in climate-related discussions given your reputation in this area. However, any substantive participation would require careful coordination with government policy." Charles felt a familiar frustration rise in his chest. Here were nations looking to the Crown for leadership on the defining issue of their time, yet he was constrained by political considerations that seemed increasingly absurd in the face of planetary emergency. The Commonwealth represented merely a third of the world's population, many of them in countries already suffering from climate impacts, yet his ability to advocate for their interests was limited by diplomatic niceties and constitutional precedent. The meeting was interrupted by an urgent message from the Communications Office. Trump had just posted on social media, once again referencing his relationship with King Charles and suggesting that the British monarch shared his skepticism about renewable energy initiatives. The post was already being picked up by news outlets and opposition politicians, with questions being raised about the palace's response to these unauthorized claims of royal support. Charles read the social media post with mounting dismay. Not only was Trump misrepresenting their conversations, but he was doing so in a way that directly contradicted everything Charles believed about environmental policy. The king found himself in the absurd position of being publicly associated with positions he privately opposed, unable to correct the record without appearing to take political sides. "We'll need to issue a clarification," the Foreign Office representative suggested. "Something that distance Your Majesty from these specific policy positions without directly contradicting a potential future president." The careful dance of diplomatic language that followed felt increasingly surreal to Charles. Hours were spent crafting a statement that would somehow communicate neutrality while correcting mischaracterizations, that would preserve relationships while maintaining dignity. Every word was weighed for its potential impact on trade negotiations, military partnerships, and intelligence sharing agreements. As the meeting finally concluded, Charles found himself alone with his thoughts in the grandeur of the palace. The weight of the crown had never felt heavier, not because of its physical mass but because of the moral compromises it seemed to demand. He thought about the young environmental activists who still wrote to him, still believing that his voice could make a difference in their fight for survival. How could he explain that the very position that gave him global recognition had also robbed him of the ability to use it meaningfully? That evening, Charles retreated to his private quarters with a stack of reports from climate scientists and environmental organizations around the world. Reading their urgent assessments by lamplight, he felt the full tragedy of his situation. Here was evidence of accelerating ice loss, rising sea levels, and ecosystem collapse. Precisely the catastrophic outcomes he had spent decades warning about. Yet his current role prevented him from speaking with the clarity and urgency the situation demanded.
The king pulled out a pad of personal stationery and began drafting a letter he knew he could never send.
In it, he poured out his frustrations about the constitutional constraints that prevented honest engagement with the climate crisis. He wrote about the moral weight of remaining silent while the planet burned, about the impossibility of maintaining diplomatic niceties in the face of existential threats, about the cruel irony of being silenced precisely when his voice was most needed. Writing the letter provided some emotional release, even knowing it would never be seen by anyone else. Charles found himself questioning whether the constitutional monarchy's emphasis on political neutrality made sense in an age when some issues transcended traditional political categories. Could remaining above politics be considered a moral position when politics was failing to address threats to human survival? The following morning brought news of another climate-related disaster. Flooding in South Asia that had displaced hundreds of thousands of people. Charles read the reports while eating breakfast, his eggs growing cold as he absorbed the scale of human suffering that might have been prevented with earlier, more decisive action on emissions reduction. The irony was not lost on him that he would likely be asked to send a message of sympathy to the affected populations while remaining constitutionally prevented from addressing the underlying causes of their suffering. As his reign progressed, Charles began to develop a more nuanced understanding of his role's possibilities and limitations. Working within constitutional constraints, he found ways to support environmental causes through patronages, royal visits to green technology facilities, and careful selection of initiatives that received royal approval. These actions, while meaningful, felt inadequate to the scale of the challenge, but they represented the boundaries of what was possible within the system he had inherited. The king also began to recognize that his struggle reflected broader tensions within democratic societies about how to address long-term existential threats when political systems were designed around shorter-term electoral cycles. His constitutional silence was perhaps emblematic of democracy's difficulty in responding adequately to challenges that required sustained, non-partisan action over decades. Yet even as Charles developed intellectual frameworks for understanding his constraints, the emotional toll remained heavy. Each interaction with climate-denying leaders, each carefully neutral statement on environmental issues, each missed opportunity to speak with the urgency the science demanded, all of it accumulated into a weight that sometimes felt unbearable. The crown that had once represented the pinnacle of public service now sometimes felt like an elaborate prison, beautiful and prestigious, but ultimately constraining. Charles found himself envying his younger self, the Prince of Wales who could speak passionately about environmental threats without considering diplomatic consequences or constitutional precedent. As he looked ahead to the remainder of his reign, Charles began to accept that this tension between personal conviction and constitutional duty would define his time as king. The challenge would be finding ways to serve meaningfully within those constraints while preserving the institution for future generations, who might face different but equally complex moral challenges. The weight of the crown, he realized, was not just about the responsibilities of leadership, but about the personal sacrifices required to maintain an institution that served purposes larger than any individual's desires or convictions. It was a burden that demanded not just public service but personal silence, not just duty but the abdication of the very principles that had shaped his character before he inherited the throne. In quiet moments, Charles sometimes wondered whether future historians would understand the impossible position in which he had found himself, caught between the urgent demands of planetary crisis and the careful neutrality required of constitutional monarchy. But such speculation was itself a luxury he could rarely afford, as each day brought new diplomatic challenges that required him to smile politely while the world burned around him.